In this monograph, we will get to know dietary fiber a little better, so that you can judge the value it deserves. And let's start by looking at what exactly dietary fiber is. Dietary fiber is the edible part of vegetables composed of substances that cannot be hydrolyzed by digestive enzymes, nor absorbed in the small intestine. Therefore, dietary fiber should not be considered a nutrient. Dietary fiber is composed of complex carbohydrates such as oligosaccharides, celluloses, hemicelluloses, pectins, inulin, and resistant starches, phenols such as lignans, and other substances such as gums and mucilages. Celluloses, hemicelluloses, pectins, and lignans are important components of plants as they form the cell wall that covers plant cells. Plant cells are enveloped by a cell membrane that separates the content of the cell from its environment, and on the outside of this membrane is the cell wall, which is a tough, rigid layer made up of celluloses, hemicelluloses, pectins, and lignans. Oligosaccharides are also very important for plants as they are key for signaling and communication in cells and tissues. Inulin and resistant starches constitute the energy reserves of plants. Starches are carbohydrates and can generally be digested by digestive enzymes without any problem. However, there are some starches that are resistant to enzymatic digestion for different reasons. Type I resistant starch cannot be digested because it is physically inaccessible to digestive enzymes, as it is surrounded by an indigestible matrix, which is the cell wall. This type of starch is found naturally in whole cereal grains and legumes. Type II resistant starch cannot be digested because it is in compact granules, which also limits the accessibility of digestive enzymes. This type of starch is found in raw foods such as green bananas. Type III resistant starch is a retrograded starch that forms during the cooling of starch that has previously gelatinized upon heat treatment and is present in foods that are cooled after cooking before consumption, such as bread or cooked potatoes that are eaten cold. Several cycles of reheating and cooling increase the amount of this type of starch. Finally, there is type IV resistant starch, which is a type of chemically modified starch. This type of starch is used as an ingredient in processed foods such as soups and baby food, although its use is still restricted in many countries. Gums and mucilages also play important roles in plants. Gums are substances that are secreted through the pores of diseased or damaged tissues and form an exudate that protects wounds and cracks. And finally, mucilages are very important for seeds as they help their germination. When they come into contact with water, the mucilage increases in volume, causing a moist layer to form around the seed, which facilitates germination while protecting the seed from external damage. The insoluble components of fiber are celluloses, some hemicelluloses, and lignans, while the soluble components are oligosaccharides, some hemicelluloses, inulin, pectins, resistant starches, gums, and mucilages. Let's see now how dietary fiber acts in our body.
The insoluble components of fiber act by increasing the size of the stool. When the stool increases in size, there is a stretching of the intestinal wall and a stimulation of the mechanoreceptors, with the consequent stimulation of the reflexes of propulsion and evacuation of the stool. This is important to avoid constipation. Insoluble fiber therefore reduces the time that feces are in the colon, which can reduce the risk of colon cancer since feces contain toxins which, if they are in contact with the cells of the intestine for a prolonged period of time, can damage them and favor the formation of tumors. The soluble components of the fiber attract water, and during digestion, they dissolve, creating a gel which increases stool viscosity and volume, and therefore increases intestinal motility, and provides a feeling of satiety. In addition, it forms a matrix that can trap water-soluble nutrients, such as sugars, and slow their passage into the blood, which avoids insulin spikes and makes the energy provided by these sugars more stable and long-lasting. It can also trap cholesterol-containing bile, facilitating its elimination in the feces and thus reducing cholesterol levels. And finally, it can also trap low molecular weight nutrients such as amino acids, minerals, and vitamins. The fact that this gel, which is generated from the soluble components of fiber, can trap nutrients suggests that fiber is not only not a nutrient, but could even be considered an anti-nutrient. Dietary fiber also has a very positive effect on the intestinal microbiota, helping to keep it diverse and healthy, and thus preventing dysbiosis, alteration of the intestinal barrier, and infections. In the large intestine or colon, there are epithelial cells, and these cells are covered by a mucus where the bacteria that constitute the intestinal microbiota live. The colon receives food remains that we cannot digest in the small intestine, and the main component of which is dietary fiber. The bacteria of the intestinal microbiota can digest this fiber that serves them as food. In the intestinal microbiota, there are different types of bacteria. Bacteria that can only feed on fiber in green color. Bacteria that in addition to fiber can feed on the oligosaccharides that form intestinal mucus in orange, and some pathogenic bacteria in violet. If we consume a diet rich in fiber for a long period of time, all the bacteria have food, so they all grow healthily and multiply, which maintains the diversity of the microbiota. If, on the other hand, we consume a diet which is very poor in fiber, and for a long period of time, the bacteria that can only feed on fiber will not have enough food and will die, while the bacteria that can also feed on intestinal mucus will survive and multiply, occupying the space left by the fiber-dependent bacteria while reducing the thickness of the intestinal mucus they consume as food. The reduction in intestinal mucus thickness can be used by pathogenic bacteria to access the intestinal epithelium, damage it, and even cause infections. Lack of dietary fiber can therefore induce dysbiosis, alteration of the intestinal barrier, and infections. Dietary fiber also helps the intestinal microbiota to synthesize short-chain fatty acids and vitamins that are very beneficial to the body. The intestinal microbiota digests the remains of food that reach the large intestine, that is dietary fiber, through a process called fermentation, during which short-chain fatty acids and vitamins are produced, which are absorbed and pass into the blood. It is important to note that not all dietary fiber components are equally fermentable. The most fermentable components of fiber are pectins, oligosaccharides, resistant starches, inulin, and the gums, which can be fermented completely. Between 60 and 90% of hemicelluloses can be fermented, and between 20 and 80% of celluloses, while lignin cannot be fermented. Let's see now, what is the therapeutic potential of dietary fiber based on the mechanisms of action we have just seen? Until 1975, the presence of fiber in food was considered something negative, since it was believed that fiber reduced the nutritional value of food based on the belief, as it was not digested, it could not be absorbed, and therefore could not play a nutritional role. From 1975 onwards, the beneficial role of dietary fiber in different pathologies began to be appreciated. It is currently considered that dietary fiber may be beneficial in cardiovascular diseases by reducing risk factors such as cholesterol levels and hypertension. It can be beneficial in diabetes, as it helps to control blood glucose levels. It can help in weight control due to the feeling of satiety it produces. It can prevent constipation by increasing the volume and viscosity of the stool and facilitating its evacuation. It can prevent gastrointestinal diseases such as diverticulitis, irritable bowel syndrome, or hemorrhoids. It can regulate the immune system and prevent autoimmune diseases. It may reduce the risk of some types of cancer, and it may protect against tooth decay by stimulating chewing and salivation. Finally, dietary fiber may also be beneficial for people affected by multiple sclerosis, since it helps to correct dysbiosis, that is to say, the alteration in the intestinal microbiota that many people affected by multiple sclerosis appear to have. And by promoting a healthy and diverse intestinal microbiota, it promotes the development of anti-inflammatory and regulatory immune cells. And it facilitates the synthesis of short-chain fatty acids and vitamins that are anti-inflammatory and neuroprotective. And what are the evidence and recommendations regarding fiber consumption? Regarding the scientific evidence that supports the beneficial effect of a nutrient, These can be preclinical evidence obtained in the laboratory either in vitro studies or in animal models, observational studies, or, in the best case, clinical trials. In the case of fiber in multiple sclerosis, there are still no clinical trials, but there are some observational studies. In particular, there is a 2017 pilot study in which it was shown that a diet rich in fiber in people affected by multiple sclerosis reduces disability, the number of relapses, and the presence of pro-inflammatory cells in blood. And also an observational study published in 2018 in which a positive effect of fiber on disability and depression was also demonstrated. There is also some preclinical evidence supporting the beneficial effect of some fiber components in multiple sclerosis. In particular, it has been observed a clear protective effect of celluloses and guar gum on the development of experimental autoimmune encephalitis, the animal model of multiple sclerosis, while the protective effect of other fiber components such as inulin and pectins was much lower. In general, the consumption of dietary fiber is higher in women than in men, higher in rural than in urban areas, and higher in poor countries than in rich countries. The average consumption of fiber in Europe is around 20 grams per day, although this can vary greatly from one country to another. While in the United Kingdom, the average consumption is only about 12 grams per day. In Spain, this consumption is 22 grams per day. And in Italy, it rises to about 24 grams per day. In the United States, fiber consumption is low, at around 13 grams per day. In developing countries in Africa, America, and Asia, the average fiber consumption is between 60 and 100 grams per day. The recommended dose of dietary fiber for adults is between 25 and 30 grams daily. And of this fiber, 70% should be insoluble fiber and 30% soluble fiber. For that reason, it is important to know not only the amount of dietary fiber that contains the foods, but also which percentage of this fiber is insoluble and which percentage is soluble. In children, the amount of fiber they need depends on their age. The recommended amount would be between their age plus 5 and their age plus 10 grams daily. That is to say, a child of 5 years should consume between 10 and 15 grams of fiber daily, and a child of 10 years between 15 and 20 grams daily. At the moment, there is no optimal dose for people affected by multiple sclerosis, so the recommendation for these people is identical to the recommendation for the general population. And what are the main sources of dietary fiber? There is fiber in all parts of plants, in leaves, stems, roots, fruits, and seeds. In fruits, the type of fiber varies according to the ripening stage. In unripe fruit, the most abundant fiber is soluble fiber such as hemicelluloses and pectins, while in ripe fruit, the most abundant fiber is insoluble fiber such as celluloses and lignin. And where does the fiber we eat come from? Most of the fiber we eat comes from grains and cereals. Our second source of fiber is fruit and vegetables, and the third source is legumes and nuts. Let's see now the fiber content of some cereals and their derivatives. 100 grams of wheat contains 12.5 grams of fiber, of wheat bran 44, of rye 16, of barley 18, of corn 10, of brown rice 19, of refined rice 3.5, of whole wheat flour 9.5, of white flour 3.1, of whole wheat bread 8.5, and of white bread 3 grams. As we have just mentioned, the recommended dose of fiber in adults is between 25 and 30 grams per day, which is relatively easy to achieve if whole grains or derivatives of whole grains are consumed. As we have also just mentioned, it is recommended that 70% of the fiber we consume be insoluble and 30% soluble. For that reason, it is not only important how much fiber is contained in the foods we consume, but also which type of fiber. Here, you have the percentages of soluble and insoluble fiber in these cereals and their derivatives. As you can see, most of the fiber contained in cereals is insoluble fiber, which makes it easier to follow the recommendations. In some, such as wheat bran or brown rice, almost 90% of their fiber is insoluble. In others, such as corn or cereal derivatives, that is bread or flour, 70% of the fiber is insoluble. Let's now take a look at the fiber content of some fruits and vegetables. 100 grams of cauliflower contain 1.8 grams of fiber, of potatoes 2.2, of carrots 3.5, of peas 6.5, of tomato 1.5, of banana 1.8, of apple 4.4, and of strawberries 2.1 grams. As you can see, fruits and vegetables contain much less fiber than cereals. As the cereals, the fruits and vegetables contain in general more insoluble fiber than soluble, although the difference between these two types of fiber is minor. In carrots, peas, or tomatoes, about 70% of the fiber is insoluble. In other vegetables such as cauliflower, bananas, apples, or strawberries, it is 60%, while in potatoes, insoluble fiber is only 49% of all fiber. And finally, let's see how much fiber legumes and nuts contain. In 100 grams of chickpeas, there are 11 grams of fiber, of lentils 12, of beans 24, of walnuts 14, of peanuts 9.5, of almonds 19, of dried plums 16, and of dried figs 18 grams. As you can see, the fiber content of legumes and nuts is quite high and similar to that of whole grains. Beans are one of the legumes with more fiber. Regarding the percentage of soluble and insoluble fiber in these legumes and nuts, in most nuts, the insoluble fiber is more abundant than the soluble one, while in legumes, the percentage of each type of fiber varies a lot depending on the legume. In lentils, 74% of the fiber is insoluble, in beans 52%, while in chickpeas only 38%. Fiber can also be found in commercial fiber preparations such as all-brand cereals, cookies and bars rich in fiber, or supplements. Finally, it is also important to note that, although fiber is a very beneficial product for health, it can also be a source of problems. Dietary fiber can have adverse effects on certain people because it can induce allergy, produce gastrointestinal discomfort such as pain, flatulence, or diarrhea, and it can also have an anti-nutrient effect by hindering the absorption of nutrients such as vitamins and minerals, or even hinder the absorption of some medications.